In this video, we're going to talk about prioritizing investments for biodiversity conservation. Part of that will be looking at the concept of biodiversity hotspots. And as a special, unique aspect to this video, we're going to see what I looked like about 10 years ago when I was in South Africa working in one of these biodiversity hotspots. So let's move forward and we'll talk a little bit more about these conservation approaches. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe the concept of a biodiversity hotspot. You should be able to explain some of the trade-offs that come between investments in biodiversity preservation and the conservation impact that you get from those investments. Lastly, you should be able to describe how local community engagement can influence conservation success and explain why this has become so critical to conservation and biodiversity preservation. A biodiversity hotspot is a formal definition that is now used frequently in conservation biology. To be a hotspot, a region needs to have at least 1,500 species of vascular plants that are found nowhere else in the world. The biological term for these types of species is endemic, meaning they only occur in one location. The second criterion for a biodiversity hotspot is that there is at least 70% of the native habitat intact. With those two criteria, there are about 36 global hotspots that are home to about 2 billion people, including many people on the lowest income ranges on the planet. We'll look at a map of these biodiversity hotspots on the next slide. The overall concept of biodiversity hotspots came from a 1988 publication by Norman Meyer, looking at 10 tropical forest hotspots, but it has expanded over the last 3 decades to incorporate a range of ecosystems across all the continents except Antarctica. As you can see in this image, there are biodiversity hotspots all over the world. But there are some interesting patterns on this map, including the distribution of these hotspots in areas that are close to oceans and the very large number of hotspots that are present in Southeast Asia and South America. There's also a number of hotspots that incorporate cities, so these aren't just pristine areas where humans don't live. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about South Africa. You can see that region at the very southern tip of the African continent. The southern part of South Africa is extraordinarily rich in species diversity and has a number of species that are endemic to the region in an area called the Cape Floristic region, which is found in and around the Cape Town area. There are almost 9,400 known species of vascular plants, about 68% of which are only found in this region. There are also some unique types of ecosystems here, including the succulent karoo, which contains an enormous diversity of succulent species, and the mountain fynbos, which I'll talk about in a moment on the video. I spent some time in this part of the world on a research project between 2010 and 2013, and I happened to make the next video during that time in a particularly spectacular part of the mountain fynbos. This place we're in right here gives us a chance to bring together a number of different components of things we've talked about in the ecosystem chapter, then the population, community, and also in the biodiversity chapter. We're in a mountain fynbos ecosystem in South Africa. So let's just start with the soil, part of the ecosystem. So in the ecosystem concept, you've got physical components and biological components. So sandy soils, rich with organic matter, nutrient poor, that's part of what defines these ecosystems. And then as I walk out into here, one of the things you'll see is the biological community. So that community in the fynbos makes up a number of different components. We've got different types of plant called a restio, and all the number of restios in this area would be the population. Over here we've got a very interesting, unique plant called a protea. Has beautiful flowers up on top. This is a protea. Again, a species that is present in a number of different individuals here. That makes a population. And together with what are called ericas, the restios, and then bulbs that aren't blooming right now, that makes up this biological community. The other things we can talk about here, you just sort of look around in this area, is diversity. So you see that diversity in front of you with all these species that are present. But one of the other things you see, well, two things. One is biodiversity in this region is exceptionally high. There's something like 9,000 plant species in this floristic region here. This is one of the hot spots that we talk about with biodiversity. This is one of the top 20 most biologically diverse areas in terms of plant species worldwide. The other thing is endemism. Many of these species that are present here do not occur anywhere else on the planet. Very, very unique, adapted to these specific conditions. The other thing is threatened ecosystems. These mountain famous ecosystems, there are very, very few of these systems left. This is one of them. It's a spectacular example. And so together, all those different concepts, ecosystems, abiotic components, biological communities, populations, endemism, biodiversity, they all start to fit together when you're sitting in a place such as this mountain famous ecosystem in South Africa.
Now that we've seen one of these hotspots in a video, let's talk about how you manage conservation in these areas and why the biodiversity hotspots have been such a target for conservation investments. Making a long story short, the basic idea is that there's never enough money for conservation, and so the question is, where do you spend the money so it has the largest positive impact? The biodiversity hotspot concept was developed with this idea in mind. You can imagine that if you had $1 million and you want to preserve species, it would potentially make good sense to invest that money in a place with high overall species diversity and a large number of endemic species. This isn't the only way that biodiversity conservation is done, but it is an important part of the global approach to conserving biodiversity. The money that's put into this type of conservation comes from major conservation organizations, national development organizations, international funding mechanisms attached to the United Nations, and sometimes from corporations. Before we look at an example of the types of conservation investments that are made, there's another important concept to understand, and that's community engagement in conservation activities. In the past, conservation activities had a tendency to set aside land and prevent any human use in those areas. This has been certainly true in the United States, where many national parks were created with very restrictive rules about use. These decisions preserved amazing areas for all of us to see and explore today, but land protection like this can be very controversial, and it can have clear negative impacts for the people who live around the areas that are being set aside for preservation. One of the key observations that emerged from conservation efforts in the 1970s and 80s is that land preservation and biodiversity protection are likely to fail if local communities are not engaged, especially when those communities are economically or otherwise dependent on the resources that are present in those areas. In the case of biodiversity hotspots, these areas are home to about 2 billion people, including some of the world's poorest populations, and so there are obvious ethical considerations when you try to preserve land that is also providing food or economic opportunity to some of the world's poorest people. From a strictly practical standpoint, it's just simply hard to preserve biodiversity and land if the local communities are not engaged in the process and if they do not benefit in some way from the conservation efforts. I've included an example here from the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which is an investment and grant-making organization that works in biodiversity hotspots with communities to preserve and protect important areas for biodiversity. The example here, which you can read about more by following the web link that's on the page, is an area in Cambodia where farmers are engaged in decisions about preservation and protection of wildlife. The text here is from the website and is a great example of spending money to support local communities. In this case, to practice organic farming in exchange for help protecting and preserving important biodiversity assets in the region. One of the great outcomes of this effort was increased income for these farmers, which then makes it more likely that these conservation efforts will be maintained in the future. This website has more examples similar to this one if you want to learn more about the different approaches that are used around the world to engage communities in conservation activities. To summarize, biodiversity hotspots are areas with very high diversity and high endemism. These hotspots are located around the world and are home to over 2 billion people. When it comes to conservation, there's never going to be enough money, and so the idea with hotspots is to spend limited resources in the places will have the greatest impact. And lastly, conservation is likely to fail if local communities are not engaged. The fact that so much biodiversity exists in areas where there's also a high degree of poverty also highlights what global equity and environmental protection are important to consider at the same time.